guess through one of my friends who's in the traveling business. He's a friend of his brother. And his brother lives in Sunnyvale.
Hi, Dale. Nice to see you again. When you're first meeting Bonnie, nice to see you. I see what they mean about not advertising the flyers.
Hello.
We're playing with all new equipment. I just bought it like 2 days ago.
Hello.
And so,
Does this sound like a microphone to you?
yeah, it does.
Hello, does it sound like Mike?
One thing, okay, I only have 2 instruments going. I have the keyboard, okay, and I have my voice. Okay, and I can adjust both of them. Okay, so if you want the voice louder, do 2, go 2. If you want the keyboard louder, do 1. If they're both too loud, go like this. Okay?
Is this any different than talking?
Hello? Or just use it.
Not much, it's about the same. So-
But it looks cool.
Can you turn it on? It's not as loud as yours.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, yours is louder.
That's a crummy microphone, that's why I get rid of some of them.
Oh, I see.
let's see. Is
Yeah,
that better?
now it's better.
Okay,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
way when Joe videotapes it, it'll help. Okay. These are all experiments.
They were experimenting though.
I learned about this because, this feels weird, because Dale spoke about cyber invasion, and hopefully he has copies here, so it was at his lecture, Dale and Bonnie's lecture, that learned about this opportunity at the Campbell Library where they apparently do not advertise the lecture, but you can have it, and it's wonderful when your friends come.
Thanks for letting me know. Sorry.
You said the other instruments yourself.
Yeah, I just turned it off.
So how's that? It does, you can hear it? Sounds
Yeah.
like,
I can agree with
it
it.
just sounds strange to me. You're holding a thing
It's
in,
muffled, that speaker's muffled.
Turn up the treble a little bit.
turn up the treble of this.
Yeah, probably right. Okay, EQ up.
You know, I think once the music starts.
Yeah.
there'll
I'm so
probably
unused to
still
it,
be some
I'll
people
probably
who
put it down.
wonder.
It's so weird to me. How does it sound without it? Quite different, about the same. I'll at least do a little bit. In fact, Joe, why don't you,
Yeah, it does.
Joe, put it on your, why don't you videotape it for a few minutes so we can experiment, then I'll put it away.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, it's on now?
Mhm.
Oh, this is an experiment. Does this sound better? It feels so weird to have a black thing in front of your face. It doesn't feel very natural to me.
It will pick up the sound better that way.
It will?
Yes,
But
it
then
will.
you have this thing in front of your face.
Okay, you don't have to hold it in your mouth, you know, just,
Even like this?
Yeah.
Is that, really?
Yeah.
Like that? Okay. Well, I guess we should begin.
So it's not 7:30.
Well, it's not 7:30, but
Yeah. 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes for Madeline's magic manifestation. Wait, they don't seem to be, they had it all worked out, they were gonna make a hot announcement, and then they said, it's story time.
Well, was it announced in any other place?
I don't think they advertised it. You brought some
Well,
flyers of ours. Maybe-
Yeah, they put some flyers up when I did it. They said they put some in the library, and they said they would send them to a couple of the other libraries in the area.
I didn't find any
Yeah,
I didn't see
I
anything.
put them up at the senior centers
for yours,
myself, yeah.
on yours, yeah.
No, a good thing to do is call Campbell Paper. They're always looking for little
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah,
you know. They
yeah.
don't have any
Well,
writing
Dale has
on
been featured
Campbell.
recently in the paper, right?
Yeah,
were?
the Campbell Reporter.
Yeah, he's been featured author. And Dale and I are part of kind of a coalition now of local authors who are emerging, or the outsider authors. Emerging.
How are you guys doing on the, on eBay or, no, that's not it, is it? It's
Oh, on Amazon?
Amazon, yeah.
We don't
Yeah,
need-
well, you gotta be careful. That can get pretty discouraging. I'm like 1,100,000. And I started at 3 million, so.
But I-
It's and, you know, I don't know how many you have to sell. I've sold maybe 30
That's it?
through Amazon and Barnes. Oh, no, I've sold close to
Yeah.
400, but
Yeah.
through Amazon and Barnes and Noble,
Yeah.
maybe 30 or 40.
Yeah, Dale was an e-published book, and I went through Inkling, a small publisher, and actually the opportunities to earn money back from the book exist, which doesn't happen if you have a large national publisher. You earn a very small percentage of your vote. Well, without further ado, welcome to our presentation tonight on Born in Berkeley. Wanted to start out by talking about world events that connect to this book. After the anniversary of the 9/11 tragedies and in the aftermath of war, we're going to share with you tonight some literary and musical selections that came out of another difficult time, the 1960s. And this is a period when the naivete, if you will, of the 50s had been shattered with the assassination of President Kennedy. Oh, thank you. The violent struggle for Negro people to vote in the South was emerging in these incipient 60s, and the beginning of a war that many thought was unjust. A time like now, in lots of ways. And then as now, writers and musicians express the pathos of the period. From Born in Berkeley, my work of historical fiction, inspired by the stories of many people that we knew, including myself, and which Inkling has recently published, we're looking at a period that I'd like to call the beat hippie axis. Although written as a memoir, Carolyn Ryder's account of her life and times draws heavily upon the author's life experiences, a time I have come to call the beat hippie axis. Hi. And that's a time when the Beats, who had become disillusioned with war and conformity of the late 40s and 50s, had, in Jack Kerouac's words, returned to the Beatitudes, the idea of living simply like the lilies of the field. And before the hippies were coined by the Chronicle, and I remember when that was as a young teenager, there was a period of idealism where the hippies, the pre-hippies, were receiving this cup that passed from the Bohemians of Jack London's time, and even before and before, and this cup had passed, and it is that particular unique time in that transition that this book is about. We'll be reading excerpts and also discussing 60s values for today and the making of the book. And having been a child of the 60s, I've learned to go with the flow, and the flow has brought some wonderful people to share with tonight. Kathryn Derby, who grew up in the same time and place as myself. Some of her experiences too, and some of those a bit older than ourselves are represented in Carolyn Ryder's experience in the new book, Born in Berkeley. And my new friend Jolene Swain also lived through a very important other side of that time, and she can definitely speak to that. So starting out with Carolyn Ryder, she says in chapter 1, born in Berkeley, I grew to my teens in a post-war suburban tract south of San Francisco, where the Beats, including the Cassidys, Ginsberg, and Kerouac, gathered. And Tupper's Park, where she grew up in the late 50s and 60s, seemed like more of a town to her than a tract. But she had difficulty with her mother, and this was sort of the propelling force for her to move away from the security of the ticky-tacky houses that Malvina Reynolds sang about, wonderful houses to people returning from the war on the GI Bill, parents who were really giving their kids the leisure to question. Only none of them knew or wanted to know what went on behind the door of our Leave It to Beaver house when they weren't there, but somehow I wish they cared. And then I'm going to describe an encounter coming back from her best friend Abigail Abogava's house. Abigail's father's an attorney. Her mother starts in on her. And in those days, child abuse, verbal abuse wasn't really recognized. In the late 50s and early 60s, we didn't have Oprah programs. One day, when she was driving us home down the frontage road from my best friend Abigail Abogava's house, she started in on me again. She stopped the engine in the middle of the road. It would serve you right if your little friend Abigail knew what you were really like. I have half a mind to drive back there now and have you tell her. What do you think of that? I stared silently at the floorboards of the old 50 Chevrolet, gripping the rounded door handle with white knuckles. She turned to whip me with her car keys. I pushed open the door, jumped out of the car, and fled into the dark recesses of the flood tree preserve. Although I wandered home alone that night, I defied her. Things would never be the same. At 11, in my own way, I was already on the road. So fleeing this difficult mother, who had problems of her own, feeling different in the conformity of Tupper's Park, Carolyn takes to the road, searching for other like-minded youth, idealists who questioned the status quo. And with them, she discovered the first 60s value, which is the value of bringing justice for those who have no voice. And Jolene, would you want to share a little bit about some of your experiences? On the other side of the coin and the other side of the country, Jolene was experiencing a parallel but different world.
Thank you. When you say not having a voice, I witnessed a family tragedy, and I'm in the process of writing a book about it. When I was 7 years old, I witnessed my father murder my mother. And when you say not having a voice, this is my granddaughter right here, Nikki. I read to her sometimes some of my writing, and some of the questions that she asked me is, why didn't they arrest your grandmother for abusing you? Today, the kids, they don't understand how a parent can just slap a child across the table just for making an innocent comment. And I told her that there was no such thing as child abuse in those days. In fact, the neighbors could spank you, bring you home, and then your parents would spank you too. So I understand what Lynn is saying about the minorities, and especially in her book. In the 60s, I witnessed prejudice. I was born in Iowa, and I was taken to Jackson, Tennessee, and my grandmother raised me, and I never in my life knew what prejudice was until 1955, and that's when Rosa Parks sat on the bus. And when I approached Jackson, Tennessee, I went over to the water fountain, and I went to the wrong water fountain. I didn't know anything about black or white or Negro or anything with color, and I drank out of the fountain that said whites only. And to my surprise, I got slapped down to the ground. And that was by my father's mother, my grandmother. And prejudice existed on both sides. My father's mother, she was very prejudiced, and then all the people around me too.
Thank you for sharing. Well, I didn't hear more about Palo Alto until my first year of high school in wealthy Atherton on the Menlo Park border. Young for my class, only a few weeks into it, Carolyn Ryder, the character, tells us, President Kennedy was shot. Whatever had been at that school shifted, or maybe it was only me. During that stage, I tried everything, trying to belong somewhere after being cast out or casting myself out of the clique I'd been bred to join. From junior high valedictorian to cotillion dance lessons, the way should have been clear. But the problems with my mother and my own nature meant I wasn't going to make it in the snobbish, materialistic, racist high school circle. I was going another way. I met, she says, a family of eccentric people who'd been sent west by the House Un-American Activities Committee back east. Emma's eccentric parents lived in the lower part of White Menlo Park that pushed against East Palo Alto. Instead of voting for Nixon like my parents, they'd been driven here from back east, Emma said, labeled communist and pinko Jews. Her mother had been at the University of California, Berkeley. The family worried about him and said he'd had a breakdown. Skinny and ragged bearded, he was the antithesis of Emma. Emma told me about Quaker meetings in Palo Alto where I heard long-haired young students sing folk songs about peace. They needed fundraisers to help Negroes vote down south. Having been trod on by my mother, I identified with the Negro's plight right away. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee appealed to me. Hovering between religion and rebellion, I'd found an answer, a way of doing something good for those on the fringes of society. SNCC raised money for civil rights workers in the South. We learned Negro voting rights activist James Meredith was wounded by gunfire on a Mississippi highway, and how a worker from Mississippi gave a speech at the university my parents had attended. These UC Berkeley administrators prevented students from collecting money for such civil rights workers. In a fiery speech, Mario Savio said, "There is a time when operation of the machine becomes so odious it makes you sick to heart. You can't take part." I joined the committee that first night and found an identity at once among the idealistic sons and daughters of Stanford professors more concerned about racial injustice than shopping. A Negro leader from East Palo Alto spotted me as a spokesperson for the cause. Weeks later, I hitchhiked home from a Presbyterian ski trip to work at the fundraiser we planned at the American Veterans Hall in Redwood City. I took up the microphone and convinced the World War II vets to give our Negro brothers down in Selma, Alabama, a real chance to participate in our great country you saved from the enemy overseas. You helped free the Jews from the concentration camps. Let's free our Negro brothers and sisters to vote. I was proud of the $500 that came back in the basket.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Carolyn Ryder, the character in Born in Berkeley, identified and found joy helping those without a voice. With other young people, she took to the road, a little bit like Saints Francis and Clare, after whom this valley had been named, and like the Beats before. Tired of war and conformity, they took what came to them, holding up their beggar's bowl to be fed with life. There she discovered a second 60s value, giving up materialism and taking the road to living simply in awe, joy, and wonder in the moment. She found herself at a very famous concert that Joan Baez was to give at the Esalen Conference Grounds with Mimi and Dick Farina and Malvina Reynolds. Satisfied, I clambered up from the very edge of the cliff to the grassy knoll and headed toward the Esalen Lodge to watch the influx of early arrivals to the Baez concert. See Joan. Beaded youth, young men and women from all over California streamed down around a radiant God's eye-shaped swimming pool below the rustic lodge and above the Big Sur Sea. Those who crashed along the road in redwoods, or like me, who'd slept in the isolated patch of Esalen grass, were the first to emerge. Joining them were flute-playing sandaled youth with bells and eucalyptus bead necklaces and Indian saris and hash and reefers and girlfriends and boyfriends and occasionally a baby or dog. A sense of excitement, responsibility, purity of heart flowed with them. They clotted the knoll at Esalen before the concert began. And then bursting from a shiny, narrow sports car came Baez, the magnificent, the queen, the lady, the legend of the hour. Before Baez played her guitar and sang, the dulcimer tones of Baez's sister Mimi and Mimi's husband Dick Farina floated over the grounds. I felt my heart would break. I felt fed, hushed, healed, no longer too young, she felt. Okay. I would not go home. I would hitchhike away, down that road, and follow that beat.
Come Saturday morning, I'm going away with my friend. We'll Saturday spend till the end of the day. Just me and my friend. We'll travel for miles on our Saturday smiles, and then we'll move on. But we will remember long after Saturday's gone.
The downside of this, taking to the road and defying society, was sometimes being misunderstood, shunned, and even arrested. Carolyn Ryder rode with two guys to Venice, California. She found a Zen boyfriend who taught her to accept in the moment. She felt young and awkward with him at the Folk Cafe near the beach. She slept in his VW bus. At 5 a.m., after thinking for a long time how uncool I was, unable to get back to sleep after this, unable to move to the left and wake him, or to the right and wake him, I decided to brush my teeth. I stumbled out of the van toward a faucet at the front of the building. Cars rumbled in the dark. Water sprayed up from the public water fountain near the curb leading to the beach. I spread Colgate from a smashed tube onto my brush, bent toward lush water sparkling in the dark, and then a male voice stormed, "Stop!" I heard it out of a hollow in the dark behind me. Hairs erected on my neck. Suddenly the sky was flooded with light. "Orange County Sheriff," a voice announced. Carolyn was arrested and made to taken to a juvenile facility in Orange County by people who thought of her as an incipient hippie, as some kind of a strange animal. She was denuded and made to bend down, scrapping for bits of soap, and finally put in a cell where she enjoyed thinking in Zen terms about acceptance. With a stub of pencil, I wrote on a piece of toilet paper. It tore. I tried a blank spot on the back of a battered Reader's Digest. Each moment presents itself to me in peace. I have surrendered to life, or to a step so far beyond me that life is slow to meet me coming backward. Other odd, wayward thoughts that didn't trouble me at all flowed across my mind. Then I heard the sound of a girl calling out, though unclear. It seemed to be from outside. I pressed my voice toward the double-grilled window slit, open to the outer yard. "Who's there?"
It's me, Tanya.
Came a voice from the window next door.
Are you the new girl? Can you call my mother in Monterey?
"I just got here.
What on?
Runaway, I guess."
Ever been here before?
"No, I live near San Francisco."
You get out then. My mother won't call. She was here once. I need to call her.
"Except, you were crying." I said, "Can I help you?"
Yeah, call her. Call my mother. I came here out of a foster home. They were mean. Call my mother.
I promised to do so. Took down her number with that stub of pencil on the inside flap of the Reader's Digest. Tanya continued to implore me.
She hasn't been here to see me for 6 weeks, since they're talking of going to send me out into a new foster place.
"I'll call your mom."
I'm just a fool with a stranger, a traveling fool. This world of woe, but there's no trouble
started to question at this time, Carolyn was called back to Berkeley to join with older students coming out of the University of California who were daring to oppose our government's policy in a war. That time, it was called Vietnam. From this, she learned the third 60s value, protesting the pain of war, standing for peace. From Born in Berkeley, Chapter 8. Berkeley, 1966, Anti-Vietnam Day Rally at last. A littered marketplace on Saturday afternoon. I skipped down Telegraph Avenue at 3 for the big anti-Vietnam demonstration. Dr. Benjamin Spock, author of the liberal baby manuals that changed childbearing in our generation, would speak. The first anti-Vietnam march, a swirling human spiral, swept the streets with new hope. At the rally, the folk singers had sung about how from the beginning of time, warmongers each believed they had God on their side. They'd sung about Germans and Russians, and ourselves, each hating the other, pointed out the irony of each one being right, gently denounced the concept of war. Today, pushed ahead by the others in the front row, I knew we were right. This night, we had God on our side. By the next day, I was convinced we had changed the entire world. I was dismayed when the San Francisco Chronicle said there were only 3,000 of us. We knew there had been 10,000 or more. By now, we were learning the establishment lied. Despite Carolyn's youthful hope that that first march would end all wars, she and the others with her came to see the deaths of many innocent people, from young American soldiers, often Negro and Hispanic, and poor, to innocent Vietnamese people on both sides. And today, over 30 years later, the World Trade disaster of September 11th has brought the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Office workers of all colors and status, some jumping hand in hand to the other side. Also images of American soldiers, heroes and heroines, spy fighters, police officers, airline passengers and crew, and thousands of innocent people in Afghanistan as a repercussion, gone to their death. And now, after this war, the invasion of Iraq, American and British lives, and many Iraqi civilians, including the boy that was so sadly featured in major magazines last week, lying under dirty towels, dying of septicemia after losing both of his arms, or the toddler girl bleeding and crying in a Marine's arms, crying for her dead mother. These are similar times, the 60s, in 2003.
Oh
teenagers fled the pain of those times into the arms of others, also rejected by society. They turned to love and to friendship, sometimes beyond convention. In poignant encounters, they pushed the sexual boundaries then, maybe to the extreme. They found idealistic loves, fleeting sometimes like a moment's sunlight on the grass. Overnight, young women who were told to say no in the 50s as trained as girls were expected to say yes in the 60s as teenagers. Carolyn epitomizes these, learning the fourth 60s value, love, sexuality, and friendship from the heart, if not always from convention. And eventually, colleague Carolyn ended up hiding out briefly in Mexico with 60s writer Ken Kesey and beat icon Neil Cassidy, whom I also knew, as she did. And she hid in their enclave in Mexico. She was impressed, as I was, that their relationships were often rearranged very creatively and beyond convention. Here.
An overly long, metallic 2 hours later, Mountain Girl came back to scrutinize. I saw her coming, stepped aside. Who did this? She barked about the flat behind the front narrow passage or side window.
Carolyn's painting, Kesey's psychedelic bus.
Looks like a kid did it, she howled. Grateful for Mountain Girl's stoned memory loss, she should have remembered it was me. I crouched like a kid on the bus, running forward, not saying a thing. 2 men emerged from behind the bus. Mountain Girl hailed them. Ken, Neil. It's too hot to paint anymore now. She stopped at us at the men's arrival. Do it later. The painting project dismissed, she navigated from tall hips on long legs toward a meaty, curled, golden-haired man who slipped his arm behind her waist. This must be Kesey. Norris dropped his brush on the fender. Did she say Neil? He asked me. She said Neil. Blushing, painting, Norris loped toward Mountain Girl and the golden rider hero Kesey. I followed, hidden from Mountain Girl in Norris' shadow. Norris looked past them for someone else, his eyes falling first upon a clean-cut, black-haired, sky-blue-eyed Lancelot who'd come to join Kesey on his right. Norris looked at me in triumph. He was in love. Neil Cassidy? He affirmed shyly. No, Mountain Girl shook her head. That's only Babs. Then a gaunt, grizzled, short 50s-haired man who looked to be at least 60 years old, twitching, talking to himself, bobbed and wove out from behind Ken Kesey. I could see why it had taken him a long time to walk a few feet with Kesey. The grizzled man rocked and tremored from the shoulders like someone who had held him there and was shaking him out. He tremored toward us and clambered a skeletal hand on Nora's shoulder, croaking, laughing, talking back to himself as he spoke. Who's asking? Who's asking? Har, har! Gordon prodded Norris in the ribs. Norris, need Neil. Dean Moriarty from On the Road to You. Norris, befuddled, looked from the image of the first hero, handsome, blue-eyed guy from Ken's right, the bobbing, irritated old man who was everywhere at once. Gordon, obviously embarrassed in front of Ken, his hero, plucked Norris' butt and pushed him out of the little circle toward the real Neil, who released Norris and took a shuddered in circles around and made a speed freak mouth noises like the bright, weird kid with a briefcase who slobbered and said beep beep to the other boys in line at my junior high school. Ooh, Norris sucked in his breath and to his credit switched streams and followed the old man who drew him vibrating down the beach, jabbing at the air with long bony fingers, flapping leathery elbows, followed Neil Cassidy, who twisted and spun like the eternal Pied Piper.
The downside of this encounter with Kesey and Neil Cassidy, who was the prototype for Jack Kerouac's Dean Moriarty in the famous On the Road, was the pushing of drugs on all and sunder and fear and confusion as a result for some, which fell like a shadow over the idealism and potential to make changes in the world. When Carolyn returned to Berkeley, San Francisco, and had unconventional relationships of her own, as was so common at this point in time. And many were fleeting. Now, at the end of my time with him, this is her encounter with a young heir to the Chase Manhattan fortune who was finding found art in San Francisco. And after she is bedangled by his body parts, and after he gently mocks her poetry, they're getting ready to part. After my first time with him, when I'd gone back to school in Berkeley from his house in the city, I'd left a poem for him on scraps of paper. He'd made fun of me then, writing mocking renditions of my poems on humiliating postcards, sending them to me in Berkeley. Days later, he followed me over to my co-op red shingle rooming house over on the bus. I forgot I was humiliated because, kind enough to know he was wrong to mock me, he said I was a beautiful, earnest girl. Now at the end of my time with him, I stayed at his new place, higher ceilings, scary to me somehow, or was it because I was nervous since I'd taken to hitching everywhere? Tomorrow I'd leave from the Oak Street off-ramp near his house, going down to Big Sur. He played the song about how we are but a moment's sunlight, fading in the grass. Magnificent jewels of rain pelted the house, and I thought we were mere shadows, unfilled forms, waiting for the substance of people we would one day become, and waiting for the people we would one day love. You do everything right, he said, but at the wrong time. He looked at me quizzically. When you're older, you'll be okay. You'll be great. In the morning, I headed out toward the white, glimmering, rain-fresh street. I gave him one sweet kiss and didn't leave a poem. And he didn't advise me as to my youthful mistiming, but he looked sad. The song about the evening of the day, watching children play, smiling faces I can see, but not for me, played on his clock radio, played through the great bay window while I left. I never saw him again, but neither forgot. Somewhere a man I might still be interested in presides over curios in the Boston Museum. A picture of a nude Berkeley girl painted in 1967 hangs untitled in a back room. A memento to compensate for chic evenings of Coke and Brie with current museum friends. Hard to meet anyone when you're young and try your life out on them, he would say now, if he said anything at all about the subject of the painting, whose blued over Mons Veneris he would, with greater wisdom, have left just the way it was. By the time Cully entered UC Berkeley at 17, she'd come of age in one of the most pivotal decades of our time. A time of extremes, from early idealism to drug abuse, from hope for racial equality to the assassination of Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968, just as this book concludes. From Hope for Peace to the Escalation of War in Vietnam. Chapter 18, Berkeley. You can't come in here, a neat Madras-clad girl shouted above me. I can go anywhere I want, I yelled back, too absorbed in what I was writing to look up. Grabbing my poetry notebook, I sidestepped the gate, climbed through trash and flowers, and stepped up the alley between the Kappa sorority and the University of California campus. It was 1968 now. I had just arrived in Berkeley to attend my next term. It was not the first time. I was born here, and often returned here between that time and today. She looks haggard, the sorority girls tittered in the window above me. Like a dirty hippie. I didn't care. I had things to do. I would do them. I want to take a moment in concluding to just open up the discussion to 60s values and today. Where are we with the first value, justice for those who lack a voice? Maybe we do have more appreciation for racial diversity, especially in San Jose. And maybe we're even beginning to have a little appreciation for other living creatures on the earth besides the diversity of our human family. As far as the second value, turning from materialism, Jolene and I decided we've kind of blown it on that. There's not much progress. I live still bartering on a shoestring in some weird way, but most people are smarter. And it doesn't seem to be a prevailing value to try to live in that simplistic way. But it's kind of an important value because there's a great deal of joy to be found in doing that. The third value, protesting the pain of war. Since 9/11, and in the news lately, I think we've made some progress because with this war, this action, not only were there protests for peace, but there was also respect for the military people going over. And I think that's a unity of respect that we didn't see in lots of different times. The fourth value, love beyond convention. We still have a high child abuse and divorce rates and many hidden affairs. So the Kesey situation where one couple sort of spread itself out to become two other couples while people were still married, and I don't know, we're expanding a little bit in terms of gender preference, alternative relationships, but being open and being honest in this quest for soulmates, possibly we still have a long way to go. So a lot of these values are sketchy at best. It is like we have a long way to go. One happier, though, enduring value from the time that shows itself everywhere, and I noticed in watching this week, on TV commercials, take a good look, the 60s are alive. It could be in car commercials. It could be in allergy medicine commercials, maybe for baby boomers who possibly need it at this point. Music, writing, color in clothing, longer, looser hair, ecology, and commercials that sell us images of a freedom that we still dream about are still everywhere. And that's the fifth value, finally, that I have discovered in really assessing not only the book, but the time. The creative freedom to go with the flow, the fifth 60s value. And that's really how Born in Berkeley was written. I have a disabled child, and in early 1980s, I was kind of trapped in a back room, and Joe was helping with my special child, my other child, and I was really not well and kind of isolated with that illness that she had picked up at a camp for disabled children. And with pencil and with paper sort of trapped in the back room, those memories that really weren't the part that were mine, not the happiest time for me to live, flowed through. And then there were the experiences of others whom I've known. And so Born in Berkeley was written very much in that sort of right brain, in the flow, go with the flow, and the notes persisted for a while. And my late writing teacher, Louise Vernon, who was a dynamic mentor to many through the adult education system in the Valley, was saying, you know, you should put it together before her death in her 80s. So I thought, okay, I'll just put it together, just kind of make it simple and be there. And it has its flaws, and Will of Inkling, who works at Sunset, who has a small publishing company, we all learned through doing it. we had a tie-dye cover in mind, and it was just weeks. The tie-dye was too expensive for them to do. There were like 4 colors, and rather than black and bright red, it became pink, which sort of fit Carolyn Ryder. So it was a happening, and I see the book really as a catalyst for stimulating discussion about these times. The librarians told us we have to be at it, and we don't have the leeway that you did, Dale. With
Exactly 8:30.
cyber invasion, we'll need everyone's help to put it back. But I just wanted to open the discussion a little bit now to anybody else who wants to share a few minutes about your thoughts about either the book, the time, anything that you want to say. And then Madeline has books, if you'd like the author to sign tonight, we'll have time for that also. Is there anything anyone else would like to share about these pivotal times, or about the book, or raise to any of us?
You have to give us a hint.
I have to ask, did you know Sandy Sanderson at all? Is that name?
Familiar? Yeah, definitely familiar.
He did a lot to register blacks in the South, but he started here. He was a minister. He got run off the road twice before he left San Jose.
I was active
so
more with
he
people
had
in
some-
the peninsula.
Yeah, he was down in this area, but I thought you might have run across him because he had a lot to do with it.
Sam Sanders, another name from the past. Yes, can you introduce yourself?
This is strange, but I just have to share. I'm from the naivete '50s,
Okay, then
and I recall dreaming of going to that excellent nursing program at Berkeley, and I was living in Washington State. Well, at that time, out-of-state tuition was prohibited. And yet, in listening to the issues that you brought forth, I think I'd have been so swallowed, I wouldn't know what the heck was going on if I'd have been in that environment.
You've raised a really important point, and I think that I tried to make this point in this book uniquely, opposed to the sort of media stereotypes. The real pivotal people who made a difference were the tiny minority. The majority of students in Carolyn Ryder's time were involved in sororities and fraternities and nursing school, and were not very keen on it. So there was a certain point where it suddenly swung and became commercialized.
I mean, I could have been there, it would have passed me by.
Oh, sure. I mean, sure. It would just be the weirdos on Telegraph Avenue by the falafel shop. You know, and to that end, I actually wrote a little afterward that relates to that. Born in Berkeley is a memoir of a pivotal time in the mid-1960s, and although written as fiction, the facts are true. After the Beats and before the hippies were named, many neighborhoods like Tupper's Park sprang up on the San Francisco Bay Peninsula. The term beat came from the New Testament Beatitudes, which spoke of living simply. The meek shall inherit the earth. Beaten down by materialistic white American culture for the 40s and early 50s, beat outsiders wrote poetry to the beat of Negro hipsters' music. Meanwhile, mainstream World War II couples, raised in the Great Depression, bestowed attention and advantages on their post-war offspring, gave their kids a lot. Patriotic ideas and the leisure to question the 50s emphasis on conformity. Look-alike houses covered up shameful social problems. The cultural pendulum had swung too far. A small percentage of youth born in the suburban security threw off their advantages and privilege. Very like the youth of 12th century Assisi, Italy, following Saints Francis and Clare, after whom San Francisco and Santa Clara are named. The Assisi youth tossed away their parents' cloth of gold, cut their hair in this case, and took to the road, following Christ's beat message. Like these, Carolyn Derby, born in Berkeley, was ostracized by her peers, who today try to claim the Summer of Love as their own. But by 1967, the real 60s mavericks had done their work. Their civil rights, peace, and free speech marches had broken ground for Be-Ins and Grateful Dead music. Now even the popular kids, who had ridiculed their few long-haired classmates, came to hate in Ashbury streets. Put on love beats for an hour on the weekend. The commercialized hippie was in vogue. But it is to the small group of 60s youth who first gave up privilege and followed that beat to the heart of a new and timeless life, to whom this book was dedicated.
I'd like to just, if someone does want to buy one of the books and hasn't read it, it's wonderful. I very surprised when I read it, because it was more like poetry. I didn't recognize your voice at all in it, you know, because it was a very poetic type thing that came out. And
Maybe
you
it's
said,
Carolyn's voice.
because it was, well, but you said it came out of being in a room with a sick child, you know. You just never know when you're.
Yeah, she was actually not so sick from the illness that was exposed to, but as an adult, I was pretty sick for a while. And I was sick and had these two little kids, and I couldn't come much out of the room. And so it was a time to, I guess, the universe forced me to get some of it on paper. You know, maybe there are easier ways. I teach creative writing, and a number of you here have visited various of these classes and hopefully can visit with each other. But we try to work with, and the method I teach really deals with the values of the 60s, getting in the flow, in the zone, writing to music, suspending that heavy critic, and letting the five senses and the vivid imagery come in. And then we need the left brain in there, and I teach it, and Dale has been a great exponent of it. But the first thing is to get in that zone and to not criticize well that flow and that passion is really moving through you. So.
Well, I guess what I wanted to say is it's so beautifully written that it's a wonderful read.
Thank you.
I'm glad you wrote it.
Thank you. Any other comments? And I want to thank Kathryn Derby for her
More yes.
and Jolene for sharing some of the perspectives that really made some of the spoiled kids here have a good cause. Things to really do. So thank you for sharing. And thanks everyone for coming. And we'll, if anyone wants to help us promptly move this back to library story time, you're welcome to do so and hang out for a minute.